Hey there, and welcome back to another journey through the darker corners of history. Before we dive into tonight's tale of dice, desperation, and downfall, I'd love to know where you're watching from and what time it is in your part of the world. Drop a comment below. It's always fascinating to see our community scattered across the globe, all drawn together by these stories from the past. If you enjoy these deep dives into the grittier side of ancient life, consider hitting that subscribe button, but only if you genuinely find value in what we're exploring here together. These aren't just history lessons, they're windows into the human experience, reminding us that some struggles are as old as civilization itself. Now settle in, maybe dim the lights, and let's step back nearly 2,000 years to discover why being a gambling addict in ancient Rome was a special kind of hell that would make modern Vegas look like a children's playground. Picture this, you're standing in the shadows of the Circus Maximus as the sun sets over the seven hills of Rome. The roar of 250,000 spectators still echoes in your ears from the day's chariot races. Your purse, once heavy with sestertii, now contains nothing but lint and regret. Your wife doesn't know you've lost the family's entire grain allowance for the month. Your children will go hungry because you were certain, absolutely certain, that the Blues would take the final race. But here's the thing about certainty in ancient Rome. It was as reliable as a politician's promise during election season. Welcome to the world of the Roman gambling addict, where fortunes were won and lost faster than you could roll a die, where respected citizens became beggars overnight, and where the line between entertainment and enslavement was thinner than a gladiator's chance of retirement. This isn't the romanticized Rome of Hollywood epics. This is the Rome where ordinary people discovered that the house always wins, and the house was an empire that had perfected the art of taking your money. Tonight, we're going to explore what it really meant to be caught in the grip of gambling fever in the greatest empire the world had ever known. We'll walk through the streets of the Suburra, where dice games never stopped rolling. We'll peer into the private gambling dens where senators lost fortunes in single nights. We'll witness the spectacle of the circus, where a single bet could either make you rich enough to buy a villa or poor enough to sell yourself into slavery. By the time we're done, you'll understand why Roman moralists wrote such scathing critiques of gambling, why emperors both embraced and banned it, and why some Romans would literally bet their own freedom on the turn of a card, or the roll of a die. Because here's what most people don't realize about ancient Rome. Yes, it was an empire built on conquest, engineering, and law, but it was also an empire absolutely obsessed with games of chance. Gambling wasn't some underground vice hidden in dark corners. It was everywhere. It was woven into the very fabric of Roman society, from the humblest tavern to the imperial palace itself. And that made it incredibly dangerous. See, in our modern world, we have credit cards, bankruptcy laws, social safety nets. When someone hits rock bottom from gambling, there are systems in place, however flawed, to catch them. In ancient Rome, there was slavery, there was debt bondage. There was the very real possibility that a single bad bet could strip away not just your money, but your citizenship, your family, and your freedom. The Romans had a saying, alea iacta est, the die is cast. Julius Caesar supposedly said it when he crossed the Rubicon, committing himself to civil war. But for the gambling addicts of Rome, the die was always being cast. Every day, every hour, every moment, they could scrape together enough coins to make another bet. And the games? Oh, the games were everywhere. Knucklebones in the streets, dice in the taverns, betting on gladiator matches, chariot races, animal hunts. Romans would bet on which raindrop would reach the bottom of a window first if they thought they could make money on it. But before we dive into the specific games that destroyed lives and the stories of those who lost everything, we need to understand something crucial about Roman society. This wasn't a culture that looked down on risk-taking. Quite the opposite. Romans celebrated boldness, fortune, and the favor of the gods. They built temples to Fortuna, the goddess of luck. They believed that taking risks was a sign of virtue, of masculine courage, which made gambling addiction not just a personal failing, but a perversion of Roman values themselves. It took the noble Roman ideal of calculated risk and twisted it into something desperate and destructive. Tonight, we're going to meet the Romans who fell into that trap. The senator who bet his family's ancestral lands on a single chariot race. The merchant who thought he could beat the dice games that had been rigged for centuries. the soldier who gambled away his discharge bonus before he even made it home from campaign. Their stories aren't just about ancient history, they're about the eternal human struggle with temptation, risk, and the dangerous allure of easy money. They're about what happens when the thrill of the game becomes more important than the consequences of losing. So let's begin our journey into the gambling halls, betting rings, and game tables of ancient Rome. Let's discover why, in an empire that conquered the known world, some Romans found themselves conquered by nothing more than carved bones and painted tiles. The year is 73 BCE. Marcus Crassus, one of the wealthiest men in Rome, is hosting a dinner party at his villa on the Palatine Hill. The wine flows freely, the entertainment is exquisite, and the conversation turns, as it always does among Romans, to betting. Not small wagers, mind you. These are men who measure their wealth in millions of sestertii, who own vast estates across the Mediterranean. One guest, a senator named Gaius Verus, boasts that he can drink an entire amphora of unmixed wine without losing consciousness. The bet is set at 50,000 sestertii. Verus manages 3 cups before collapsing face first into his dinner plate. 50,000 sestertii, enough to buy a modest farm, gone in the time it takes to pour 3 cups of wine. This was Rome, a society where gambling wasn't just accepted, it was expected, where showing reluctance to bet was seen as cowardice, and where the ability to lose gracefully was considered a mark of character. But what made Roman gambling culture so dangerous wasn't the acceptance of betting. It was the sheer variety and accessibility of games available to feed an addiction. In modern terms, imagine if every street corner had a casino, every restaurant had slot machines, and every social gathering included mandatory betting. That was ancient Rome. Let's start with the most basic and ubiquitous of Roman gambling games, dice. But these weren't the simple 6-sided cubes we know today. Romans used knuckle bones, literally the ankle bones of sheep or goats, which had 4 distinct sides. Each side had a different value, and the irregularity of the bones meant that each throw was genuinely random. No weighted dice, no predictable patterns, just pure chance. The game was called tali, and it was played everywhere, in taverns, on street corners, in the baths, even in the forum during quiet moments. The rules were simple. Throw 4 knuckle bones and try to achieve certain combinations. The best throw was called the Venus throw, where each bone landed on a different side. The worst was the dog throw, where all 4 bones showed the same face. Romans would bet on their own throws, on other people's throws, on sequences of throws. They developed elaborate point systems and tournament brackets. What started as a simple game became a complex gambling ecosystem that could accommodate bets ranging from a few bronze coins to entire estates. But tali was just the beginning. Romans also played with traditional 6-sided dice called tesserae. These allowed for more complex games and higher stakes. The most popular dice game was called hazard, an ancestor of the modern game craps. Players would bet on the outcome of multiple dice throws with complex odds and payouts that required genuine mathematical skill to calculate. This is where things get interesting from a psychological perspective. The Romans developed what we would now recognize as sophisticated gambling systems. They tracked probabilities, developed betting strategies, and created elaborate theories about luck and divine favor. This wasn't mindless chance-taking. These were intelligent people applying serious thought to games of pure randomness, which made their eventual downfall even more tragic. Consider the case of Lucius Scribonius, a fictional but representative figure based on countless real examples from Roman literature and historical accounts. Scribonius was a minor magistrate, a man of moderate wealth and good reputation. He owned a small villa outside Rome, had a loving wife and 3 children, and seemed destined for a comfortable, unremarkable life. His introduction to serious gambling came through the dice games at his local tavern. At first, it was social betting, small wagers among friends, the kind of harmless entertainment that helped pass the long Roman evenings. Scribonius had a good head for mathematics and quickly developed a system for betting on dice throws based on probability calculations. And at first, his system worked. He won more often than he lost, and his friends began to respect his skill at the games. This is the crucial moment in any gambling addiction, the early success that convinces the victim they've found a way to beat the odds. Scribonius began to increase his bets. Why wager 10 sestertii when you could wager 100 and win 10 times as much? His mathematical approach gave him confidence, and his early wins gave him capital. He started frequenting the more upscale gambling establishments in the city, places where the stakes were higher and the players more sophisticated. This is where the Roman gambling scene gets truly fascinating because it wasn't a single monolithic activity. It was a complex ecosystem with different levels, different games, and different social classes. At the bottom were the street corner dice games where laborers might bet their daily wages. At the top were the private gambling clubs where senators could lose fortunes that would feed entire cities. Scribonius found himself climbing this ladder, moving from tavern games to private clubs, from copper coins to gold ori. Each level offered higher stakes and more sophisticated games, but also more experienced players and longer odds. The mathematics that had served him well in simple dice games became less reliable in the complex betting structures of the elite gambling houses. These establishments offered games that we would recognize today. Early forms of poker played with painted tiles, betting pools on gladiator matches with complex odds, even primitive roulette wheels using spinning pottery. But the house edge in these games was substantial, and the other players were often professional gamblers who made their living by separating wealthy Romans from their money. Scribonius was moving from being a big fish in a small pond to being a minnow among sharks. The psychological trap was perfectly designed. Each loss could be explained away as bad luck, a temporary setback that would be corrected by the next big win. Each small win reinforced the belief that the system worked, that success was just a matter of patience and proper application of strategy. Meanwhile, Scribonius was beginning to exhibit the classic signs of gambling addiction that we recognize today. He became secretive about his activities, lying to his wife about where he spent his evenings. He started borrowing money to fund his gambling, first from friends, then from professional moneylenders. He became irritable and distracted when he wasn't gambling, thinking constantly about his next opportunity to play. The Roman world offered unlimited opportunities to feed this addiction. Beyond the dice games and card analogs, there was the massive betting industry built around public spectacles. The chariot races at the Circus Maximus weren't just entertainment. They were the centerpiece of a gambling economy that involved hundreds of thousands of people and millions of sestertii in wagers. Every race day, which occurred dozens of times per year, the entire city became a massive betting parlor. Professional bookmakers set up booths around the circus, offering odds on individual races, daily champions, and season-long competitions. Spectators could bet on which team would win, which driver would crash, which horses would finish in what order. The betting was so integral to the races that the teams themselves were organized around it. The four main racing factions, the Reds, Blues, Greens, and Whites, functioned as much like modern sports franchises as entertainment companies. They had passionate fan bases, professional management, and carefully maintained stables of horses and drivers. And the fans didn't just cheer for their teams, they bet on them with religious fervor. A typical race day might see a working-class Roman bet a week's wages on the Blues, while a wealthy merchant might wager the profits from an entire trading voyage on a single race. The amounts involved were staggering. Historical records suggest that the total betting volume for a major race day at the Circus Maximus could equal the annual tax revenue of an entire province. This wasn't casual entertainment. It was a major economic activity that involved a significant portion of the empire's liquid wealth. For someone like our fictional Scribonius, the races offered the ultimate gambling high. Here was a chance to win truly life-changing amounts of money, to go from comfortable middle-class citizen to genuinely wealthy in the span of a single afternoon. But the races also offered the ultimate gambling low, because just as you could win a fortune in an afternoon, you could lose everything just as quickly. And unlike dice games, where you could control the pace of your betting, the races happened on a fixed schedule. When race day came, you either had money to bet or you didn't. There was no time to reconsider, no opportunity to walk away. This is where Roman gambling culture reveals its truly predatory nature. The entire system was designed to encourage maximum participation and maximum risk-taking. Social pressure, cultural expectations, and the structure of the games themselves all pushed participants toward bigger and bigger bets. And for those who couldn't afford to bet big, well, Rome had a solution for that too. The moneylenders who operated around the gambling establishments were happy to provide credit, usually at interest rates that would make a modern loan shark blush. These weren't regulated financial institutions, they were often criminal organizations that used violence to collect debts, but they were also the only way for many Romans to maintain their gambling activities when their own money ran out. The interest rates were typically around 10% per month, compounded. That means a debt of 100 sestertii would become 110 after a month, 121 after 2 months, and so on. A Roman who borrowed money to make a single bet could find himself owing double the original amount within a year, even if he never borrowed again. But of course, most gambling addicts did borrow again, and again, and again. This is where our story of Scribonius takes its inevitable dark turn. After months of increasing bets and mounting losses, he found himself owing more money than he could ever hope to repay through legitimate means. His villa was mortgaged, his wife's jewelry sold, his children's inheritance spent, and still the debt grew, and still the compulsion to bet remained. The truly insidious thing about Roman gambling culture was how it normalized the unthinkable. In our modern world, we might joke about betting the farm, but it remains a metaphor. In ancient Rome, people literally did bet the farm, and when they lost it, they bet their freedom. And when they lost that, they bet their lives. Let me tell you about the games that destroyed the most lives, starting with one that might surprise you. It wasn't dice, wasn't the races, it was a game called duodecim scripta, which translates roughly to 12 lines. Think of it as an ancient predecessor to backgammon, played on a board with 12 rows and 15 pieces per player. The game required skill, strategy, and just enough luck to keep things interesting. Players would move their pieces based on dice rolls, trying to get all 15 pieces off the board before their opponent. It sounds innocent enough, almost educational, but duodecim scripta became the cocaine of Roman gambling because it offered something that pure chance games couldn't: the illusion of control. You see, skilled players really could win more often than beginners. The game had genuine strategy, genuine tactics. A master of duodecim scripta could beat a novice 8 times out of 10, maybe 9 times out of 10. This created a false confidence that proved absolutely devastating to the Roman psyche. Consider Marcus Antonius Corvus, a real historical figure whose gambling exploits were recorded by the historian Suetonius. Corvus was a brilliant military strategist, a man who had won several major battles through careful planning and tactical brilliance. When he discovered duodecim scripta, he approached it the same way he approached warfare, through study, practice, and systematic improvement. And it worked. Corvus became genuinely skilled at the game, skilled enough to win consistently against most opponents. This success convinced him that gambling wasn't really gambling when you had skill. It was just another form of competition, like warfare or politics, where the better man usually won. The trap was perfectly set. Corvus began seeking out stronger opponents, players whose skill level matched his own. And when the skill levels were equal, luck became the deciding factor. But Corvus couldn't accept that luck had beaten him. He was a general, accustomed to winning through superior strategy. Each loss had to be analyzed, understood, overcome through better play. So he kept playing and studying and practicing, and betting larger amounts to make the games feel meaningful, to match the intensity he was accustomed to from military campaigns. The psychological hook was devastating because it felt rational. Corvus wasn't chasing random chance like some desperate dice player. He was honing his skills, improving his game, working toward mastery. The fact that he was hemorrhaging money felt secondary to the intellectual challenge. This is where Roman gambling culture reveals its true sophistication. The games weren't just designed to separate people from their money through pure chance. They were designed to exploit specific psychological weaknesses in the Roman character. Duodecim scripta exploited the Roman love of strategy and competition. Dice games exploited their belief in divine favor and fortune. The chariot races exploited their tribal loyalties and love of spectacle. But perhaps the most psychologically devastating gambling activity in ancient Rome wasn't a game at all. It was gladiator betting, and it combined every addictive element of Roman gambling into one perfect storm of destruction. Gladiator matches weren't just entertainment. They were complex sporting events with elaborate statistics, detailed records, and sophisticated betting markets. Professional gladiators had win-loss records, style matchups, injury reports. Betting on gladiator matches was like betting on modern boxing. If modern boxing involved fights to the death and took place in an arena that held 50,000 screaming spectators. The betting markets around gladiator games were incredibly sophisticated. You could bet on individual fights, tournament winners, total number of deaths in a day's events. You could bet on whether a particular gladiator would survive his next 3 fights, whether he would earn his freedom, whether he would die in the arena or retire to become a trainer. There were prop bets that would make a modern Las Vegas sportsbook jealous. Which gladiator would draw first blood? Would the crowd demand mercy for a defeated fighter? Would the emperor give a thumbs up or thumbs down? Would a particular animal kill more than 2 criminals during the beast hunts? The amounts wagered were staggering. A single gladiator match between famous fighters could generate more betting volume than most provincial cities produced in tax revenue. Wealthy Romans would mortgage estates to bet on a single fight. Poor Romans would bet their freedom. And here's the truly dark part. The gladiator schools, the people who owned and trained the fighters, were often involved in the betting. They had inside information about injuries, training, psychological state. A gladiator owner could make more money by betting against his own fighter than by winning the prize money for victory. This created a level of corruption that would make modern sports scandals look quaint. Matches were fixed, fighters were drugged, injuries were hidden or faked. The entire spectacle became an elaborate shell game designed to separate spectators from their money while providing the illusion of fair competition. For gambling addicts, gladiator betting was the ultimate high because it combined enormous potential payouts with life and death drama. When you bet on a gladiator match, you weren't just risking money. You were emotionally invested in whether another human being lived or died. The psychological intensity was unlike anything else in the Roman world. Our fictional Scribonius found himself drawn into this world as his debts mounted and his need for bigger wins became desperate. The dice games and board games that had started his addiction no longer provided enough excitement or potential profit. He needed the massive payouts that only gladiator betting could provide. But gladiator betting required a level of knowledge and connection that took time to develop. You needed to know the gladiators, understand their fighting styles, have contacts in the gladiator schools who could provide inside information. Scribonius found himself spending entire days at the gladiator training facilities, watching practice sessions, talking to trainers, trying to gain any edge that might help him pick winners. This is where gambling addiction in ancient Rome took on an almost religious quality. Addicts didn't just bet, they studied, researched, networked. They developed elaborate systems for analyzing gladiator matchups. They consulted oracles and made sacrifices to Fortuna, the goddess of luck. They wore lucky charms and performed rituals before placing bets. The Roman religious system actually encouraged this behavior. Romans believed that the gods took an active interest in human affairs, including games and contests. If you performed the right rituals, made the right sacrifices, lived virtuously, the gods might favor your bets. Gambling became a form of religious practice, a way of communicating with the divine. This religious dimension made gambling addiction incredibly difficult to overcome because it wasn't seen as a moral failing. It was seen as a spiritual quest. A Roman who lost consistently wasn't unlucky. He was impious. The solution wasn't to stop gambling, it was to become more religious, to make larger sacrifices, to purify oneself more thoroughly. Scribonius found himself caught in this spiritual gambling trap. Each loss was evidence that he hadn't pleased the gods sufficiently. Each win was proof that his religious practices were working and should be continued. The gambling and the religious observance became intertwined in a way that made both more compulsive. He began making increasingly elaborate sacrifices before placing bets. A sheep before a major gladiator match, a bull before betting his remaining property on the chariot races. The cost of the religious rituals sometimes exceeded the amount of the bets themselves, but Scribonius couldn't see the irony. In his mind, the sacrifices were investments that would ensure divine favor and gambling success. Meanwhile, his debts continued to mount, and the moneylenders were becoming impatient. Roman debt collection was not a gentle process. Creditors had the legal right to seize debtors' property, including their families. A man who couldn't pay his gambling debts might find his wife and children sold into slavery to satisfy the debt. This wasn't a theoretical threat. Roman law explicitly allowed creditors to sell debtors and their families into bondage. The practice was common enough that there were established markets for debt slaves, people who had been free Roman citizens until their gambling debts or other financial obligations destroyed their legal status. The prospect of enslaving one's own family was supposed to serve as a deterrent to excessive borrowing, but for gambling addicts, it often had the opposite effect. The stakes became so high, the potential consequences so severe, that the only rational response seemed to be bigger bets with bigger potential payouts. If you owed enough money to lose your freedom anyway, why not bet everything on one final throw of the dice? If your family was going to be enslaved regardless, why not risk it all on one last gladiator match? The logic was twisted but emotionally compelling. When you have nothing left to lose, you might as well risk everything on the chance of winning it all back. This is where Roman gambling culture reveals its most predatory aspect. The system was designed to push people past the point of rational decision-making. The combination of social pressure, religious belief, sophisticated games, and brutal consequences created a perfect storm that could destroy even the most intelligent and disciplined Romans. Scribonius reached his breaking point during the festival of Saturnalia, the winter celebration when normal social rules were temporarily suspended. It was traditional during Saturnalia for masters to serve their slaves, for social hierarchies to be reversed, for gambling restrictions to be relaxed. The gladiator games during Saturnalia were the most elaborate of the year, featuring the most famous fighters and the largest crowds. The betting volume was enormous, and the potential payouts were correspondingly huge. Scribonius saw this as his final opportunity to win back everything he had lost. He mortgaged his family's ancestral burial plot, sold his wife's dowry jewelry, borrowed against his children's future inheritance. Everything went into one massive bet on a gladiator match between two legendary fighters. Titus the Thracian, an undefeated veteran with 47 wins, and Gaius the Giant, a massive Germanic prisoner who had killed 8 men in his first month in the arena. The odds favored Titus heavily. He was faster, more experienced, more technically skilled. But Gaius was younger, stronger, and motivated by the promise of freedom if he could win 10 consecutive matches. He had already won 9. Scribonius bet everything on Gaius. Not because he thought the Germanic fighter would win, but because the payout was so large that victory would solve all his problems instantly. A single win would pay off his debts, restore his property, save his family's freedom. It was the classic gambler's fallacy taken to its logical extreme. One big score to fix everything. The fact that the odds were against him just made the potential payout larger. In Scribonius's mind, the size of the potential win justified the risk of total ruin. The fight took place on the winter solstice, the darkest day of the year. 50,000 Romans packed the Colosseum, creating a roar that could be heard throughout the city. Scribonius watched from the cheap seats, having sold his season tickets months earlier to fund previous bets. For 20 minutes, it looked like his gamble might pay off. Gaius fought with desperate fury, landing several solid blows that staggered the veteran Titus. The crowd sensed an upset in the making, and the noise became deafening. But experience eventually told Titus weathered the initial assault, then methodically wore down his younger opponent. A perfectly timed thrust with his gladius found the gap in Gaius's armor, and the Germanic giant fell to the sand, his blood dark against the white winter light streaming through the arena's awnings. Scribonius sat in stunned silence as the crowd erupted around him. Everything was gone: his property, his freedom, his family's future. The moneylenders would come for him within days, and Roman law would strip away everything he had ever owned or loved. But here's the thing about gambling addiction: even total ruin doesn't cure it. As Scribonius sat in the arena, watching slaves drag Gaius's body across the sand, his mind was already working on the next bet. Maybe he could borrow money from his brother-in-law. Maybe he could sell information about his neighbor's property to bandits. Maybe he could bet his own freedom on the next set of matches. The addiction had become stronger than self-preservation, stronger than love for his family, stronger than rational thought. He had become a slave to the games long before Roman law would make that slavery official. This was the true horror of gambling addiction in ancient Rome. It wasn't just that you could lose your money, your property, your freedom. It was that the culture was designed to make you want to keep playing even after you had lost everything that mattered. The games never stopped. The dice kept rolling, the gladiators kept fighting. And somewhere in the shadows of the Circus Maximus, new addicts were placing their first bets, convinced that they would be different, that they would know when to stop, that they could beat odds that had been carefully calculated to destroy them. The morning after Saturnalia found Scribonius standing outside his former villa, watching as strangers inventoried his possessions. The moneylenders had moved quickly, as they always did. Roman law was beautifully efficient when it came to debt collection. No lengthy court proceedings, no appeals process. You owed money, you couldn't pay, your property became someone else's property. His wife stood beside him, holding their youngest child, her face a mask of carefully controlled despair. She hadn't spoken to him since learning the full extent of his debts. What was there to say? That she'd warned him? That she'd begged him to stop? That she'd hidden money from him only to watch him find it and lose it at the next gladiator match? But this is where the story of Roman gambling addiction takes an even darker turn. Because losing everything wasn't the end. It was just the beginning of a new chapter, one that revealed the true depths of how gambling had infected Roman society. You see, Scribonius still owed money. Losing his property had reduced his debt, but not eliminated it. The interest kept accumulating, the creditors kept demanding payment, and Roman law offered several creative solutions for what to do with debtors who had nothing left to give. The first option was debt bondage. Scribonius could indenture himself to his creditors, working off his debt through labor. The terms were rarely favorable. At the standard wage for unskilled labor, it would take him roughly 15 years to pay off what he owed, assuming he could live on nothing but bread and water and never got sick or injured. But debt bondage had an interesting quirk in Roman law. The debtor retained his citizenship and his legal rights. He was still technically a free man, just one who happened to be obligated to work for someone else until his debt was satisfied. And free men could still gamble. This is where Roman gambling culture reveals its most insidious aspect. Even debt bondage couldn't cure a gambling addiction because the games were still there, still calling, still promising that one big win could solve everything. Scribonius found himself working in a pottery workshop, making amphorae for olive oil shipments. The work was backbreaking, the hours long, the pay minimal, but pottery workshops were located near the docks, and the docks were where sailors gathered between voyages, and sailors always had dice games running. At first, Scribonius told himself he was just watching, learning the rhythms of the games, studying the players, waiting for the right opportunity. But watching dice games is like watching fire. Eventually, you want to touch it, no matter how many times you've been burned. He started small, a single sestertius here and there, money he should have been saving to reduce his debt. But small bets on dice games rarely stay small, especially when you're playing with professional gamblers who can smell desperation like sharks smell blood in the water. The dock games were different from the genteel gambling Scribonius had known in his previous life. These were serious, working-class affairs where money changed hands quickly and violence was always just beneath the surface. Cheating was common, arguments were frequent, and debts were collected with fists rather than lawsuits. But the games were also pure in a way that the elaborate gladiator betting wasn't. Just you, the dice, and whatever gods happened to be listening. No inside information, no complex odds calculations, no need to understand gladiator fighting styles or chariot team politics. Just the ancient human thrill of putting something valuable at risk and watching fate decide your future. Scribonius found this purity intoxicating. In the pottery workshop, he was nobody, just another debt slave grinding out his days to pay for past mistakes. But around the dice games, he could still feel like a player, like someone whose choices mattered. The psychological appeal was devastating. Every win, no matter how small, felt like a step back toward his former life. Every loss felt like temporary setback that could be corrected with the next throw. The fact that he was betting money he couldn't afford to lose, money that should have been reducing his debt, felt secondary to the emotional rush of being in the game. This is where we need to understand something crucial about Roman gambling culture. It wasn't just about the money, though money was certainly important. It was about identity, about social status, about the fundamental Roman belief that fortune favored the bold. A Roman who didn't gamble was seen as either poverty-stricken or cowardly. Gambling was how men proved their courage, their confidence in their own luck, their willingness to risk everything for glory. Even slaves were expected to gamble their meager earnings on feast days and holidays. For someone like Scribonius, who had fallen from respectability into debt bondage, gambling offered a way to maintain some connection to his former identity. When he threw dice with dock workers and sailors, he wasn't a failed businessman working off his debts. He was a player, a risk-taker, a man who still believed in his ability to beat the odds. The dock games also introduced Scribonius to a whole new category of Roman gambling, betting on violence, not the elaborate spectacles of the arena, but the casual, everyday violence that was part of life in the working districts of Rome. Sailors would bet on fights between dock workers. Merchants would wager on how many lashes a slave could endure before losing consciousness. Street gangs would organize brutal competitions and sell betting slips to spectators. The violence was raw, immediate, and utterly unpredictable. Scribonius found himself drawn to these contests because they offered something that dice games couldn't: the illusion of being able to read human nature. A man who could judge character, who could see strength and weakness in others, might be able to predict the outcome of a fight or an endurance contest. But human nature, it turned out, was just as unpredictable as dice. The strongest man might have a weak stomach. The most experienced fighter might slip on blood and crack his skull on the pavement. The slave who looked ready to collapse might find reserves of strength that carried him through impossible trials. Still, the betting on violence gave Scribonius something to study, something to analyze. He began keeping mental notes on fighters, tracking their performance, developing theories about what made men tough or weak. It felt like skill, like knowledge, like something more than blind chance. The reality was that he was just finding new ways to lose money he didn't have. But let's step back for a moment and look at the bigger picture of Roman gambling, because individual stories like Scribonius's were playing out across the entire empire. Gambling wasn't just a personal vice, it was a massive economic force that shaped Roman society in ways that are hard to overstate. Consider the scale. Rome at its height had a population of over 1 million people. If even 10% of them were regular gamblers, that's 100,000 people constantly moving money through games of chance. Conservative estimates suggest that gambling turnover in the city of Rome alone might have equaled 20% of the empire's total tax revenue. This wasn't just casual entertainment. This was a major economic sector that employed thousands of people and moved enormous amounts of wealth. Professional gamblers, bookmakers, loan sharks, game operators, security personnel, cleaners who swept up after the violence. Entire neighborhoods existed primarily to serve the gambling industry. The Subura, Rome's most notorious district, was essentially a 24-hour gambling zone. The narrow streets were lined with taverns where dice games never stopped, brothels where prostitutes took bets between customers, and shops that sold everything a gambler might need: lucky charms, loaded dice, forged documents for desperate debtors. Walking through the Subura at night was like walking through a fever dream of human vice. Oil lamps flickered in doorways where men huddled over bone dice. Women called out odds on impromptu wrestling matches. Children, some barely old enough to walk, ran messages between bookmakers and placed bets for illiterate customers. The noise was constant: the rattle of dice in wooden cups, the slap of coins on wooden tables, the shouts of winners and the curses of losers. Fights broke out regularly, usually over disputed bets or accusations of cheating. The City Watch avoided the area after dark, knowing that their presence would only escalate the violence. But the Subura wasn't just chaos, it was highly organized chaos, controlled by criminal syndicates that had turned gambling into a sophisticated business. These organizations operated protection rackets, loan services, and information networks that rivaled anything the official Roman government could manage. They also pioneered gambling innovations that wouldn't be seen again until modern times. Credit systems that allowed players to bet money they didn't have. Sophisticated odds calculations that ensured the house always had an edge. Marketing techniques that identified and cultivated potential gambling addicts. The syndicates understood something that individual gamblers never seemed to grasp. In the long run, the house always wins. Not because the games were rigged, though some certainly were, but because mathematics is inexorable. Every game of chance has a house edge, a small percentage that favors the operator. Over thousands of bets, that small edge becomes a massive advantage. But they also understood that you couldn't just rely on mathematics. You had to create an environment that encouraged people to keep playing even when they were losing. The successful gambling operations weren't just game parlors. They were total entertainment complexes designed to maximize the time and money customers spent on the premises. Take the Circus Maximus betting operation, which was the crown jewel of Roman gambling. This wasn't just a place to bet on chariot races, it was a complete entertainment ecosystem that operated year-round, even when no races were scheduled. During race season, the circus was obviously focused on chariot betting, but the rest of the year it hosted gladiator exhibitions, animal hunts, athletic competitions, and theatrical performances. All of them offered betting opportunities, and all of them were designed to keep the gambling public engaged and spending money. The betting infrastructure around the circus was staggering. Hundreds of bookmakers operated from permanent stalls around the track. Professional odds makers calculated payouts for thousands of different types of bets. Information brokers sold insider knowledge about horse injuries, driver rivalries, and team politics. But the real innovation was the credit system. Wealthy Romans could establish lines of credit with the major bookmakers, allowing them to bet far more than they actually had. The credit was secured by their property, their social connections, and ultimately their freedom. This credit system was what allowed gambling to reach the highest levels of Roman society. Senators could bet estates on chariot races, generals could wager the spoils of entire military campaigns. Even emperors could gamble with the treasury of the empire itself. And they did. Historical records show that some of Rome's most famous leaders were compulsive gamblers who lost fortunes that would have funded entire legions. The Emperor Caligula was said to have bet the equivalent of several provincial budgets on a single gladiator match. Nero famously wagered territories of the empire on chariot races, actually transferring administrative control of cities based on the outcome of sporting events. This high-level gambling had profound political consequences. When senators lost their fortunes to betting, they became vulnerable to corruption and bribery. When generals gambled away their war spoils, they might be tempted to start new wars to recoup their losses. When emperors treated the empire's resources as gambling stakes, the entire system became unstable. But perhaps the most devastating aspect of Roman gambling culture was how it created a permanent underclass of people who had lost everything but couldn't stop playing. These weren't just individuals like Scribonius who had fallen from respectability. These were entire families, sometimes multiple generations, trapped in cycles of debt and addiction. Consider the family of Gaius Brutus Maximus, a minor patrician whose gambling addiction destroyed not just his own life, but the lives of his descendants for generations. Maximus lost the family's ancestral lands in a single night of dice games, then borrowed against his children's inheritance to continue playing. When Maximus died, still heavily in debt, his eldest son inherited not wealth, but obligation. The son spent his entire life working to pay off his father's gambling debts, never able to accumulate enough wealth to improve his family's situation. When he died, his son inherited the same burden. For 3 generations, the family remained trapped in debt bondage, their labor going to pay for dice games that had been played before they were born. The original debt, compounded by interest and penalties, had grown so large that it could never realistically be repaid. The family had become hereditary slaves to the gambling industry. This wasn't unusual. Roman law allowed gambling debts to be inherited, and the interest rates were so high that debts often grew faster than they could be paid off. Entire bloodlines could be destroyed by a single night of bad luck at the dice tables. The social consequences were enormous. Rome developed a large population of people who were technically free but economically enslaved, working not for their own betterment but to service gambling debts they had never incurred. These debt slaves formed a permanent underclass that provided cheap labor for the empire's industries, while having no hope of social advancement. But the gambling industry also created opportunities for those smart enough to work the system from the other side. Professional gamblers, bookmakers, and casino operators could accumulate enormous wealth by exploiting the addictions of their customers. Some of the richest men in Rome made their fortunes not through trade or conquest, but through gambling operations. They understood that the real money wasn't in playing the games, it was in running them. While individual gamblers might win or lose fortunes, the house always came out ahead in the long run. These gambling entrepreneurs became some of the most powerful people in the empire, with influence that rivaled senators and generals. They had vast networks of informants, sophisticated understanding of human psychology, and access to enormous amounts of liquid capital. They also had something that traditional Roman elites often lacked: practical experience with the darker aspects of human nature. While patrician families might understand politics and warfare, the gambling operators understood addiction, desperation, and the lengths to which people would go when they had nothing left to lose. This understanding made them valuable allies and dangerous enemies. A gambling operator who knew which senators owed money, which generals had lost their war spoils, which merchants were borrowing against their next trading voyage, had leverage over some of the most powerful people in the empire. The information networks that supported the gambling industry were also incredibly sophisticated. Bookmakers needed to know about horse injuries, gladiator training, chariot team politics, weather conditions, and hundreds of other factors that might affect the outcome of events. This information was valuable not just for setting odds, but for political and economic intelligence. A bookmaker who knew that a particular gladiator was fighting with a hidden injury might also know that his wealthy patron was betting heavily on the match. A casino operator who understood which chariot teams were strongest might also understand which senators were supporting those teams for political reasons. This intersection of gambling and politics created a shadow information economy that operated parallel to the official Roman government. Decisions that affected the empire were sometimes made not in the Senate or the imperial palace, but in the back rooms of gambling establishments where the real power brokers met to share information and coordinate their activities. But let's return to our individual story, because while these larger forces were shaping the empire, Scribonius was still trapped in his personal cycle of addiction and debt, working in the pottery shop by day, gambling with dock workers by night, always one bet away from either salvation or complete ruin. The debt bondage was supposed to last 15 years, but Scribonius's continued gambling was extending that period indefinitely. Every sestertius he lost at dice was another day of labor he owed to his creditors. What had started as a manageable, if lengthy, repayment plan had become an open-ended sentence. His wife had stopped visiting him, his children had been taken in by relatives who made it clear that Scribonius was no longer welcome in their homes. His former friends avoided him, partly from embarrassment, but mostly from fear that he might try to borrow money. But the isolation only made the gambling more appealing. When you have nothing left to lose, when every relationship has been destroyed and every bridge has been burned, the dice games become more than entertainment. They become the only place where you still matter, where your choices still have consequences, where the future still holds possibilities. This is the final psychological trap of gambling addiction. It becomes self-reinforcing. The more you lose, the more you need to gamble. The more isolated you become, the more the gambling community becomes your only social outlet. The more desperate your situation becomes, the more attractive those long-shot bets appear. Scribonius found himself betting on increasingly desperate propositions. Could he drink a cup of olive oil without vomiting? Could he hold his breath underwater longer than a professional pearl diver? Could he walk across hot coals without crying out in pain? These weren't games of skill or chance. They were tests of human endurance, bets on his own ability to withstand pain and humiliation. But they offered something that regular gambling couldn't, the possibility of winning through pure determination rather than luck. Of course, determination isn't enough when you're betting against professional entertainers who make their living by enduring pain for paying audiences. Scribonius lost more often than he won, and each loss left him more damaged, more desperate, more convinced that the next bet would be different. The physical toll was becoming obvious. Years of poor nutrition, inadequate sleep, and constant stress had aged him beyond his years. The man who had once been a respected magistrate now looked like a broken-down laborer, scarred from various betting contests, missing teeth from fights over disputed dice throws. But the psychological toll was worse. Scribonius had lost the ability to imagine a future that didn't involve gambling. When he thought about eventually paying off his debts, he didn't envision returning to a normal life. He envisioned having enough money to make bigger bets, to play in higher stakes games, to finally hit the big score that would justify all the years of suffering. The addiction had become total. It wasn't just that he couldn't stop gambling, he couldn't conceive of stopping. The games had become his identity, his purpose, his reason for existing. Everything else, family, career, social status, physical health, had become secondary to the pursuit of that next win. This is where Roman gambling culture reveals its most tragic aspect. It didn't just destroy individual lives, it created a permanent class of people who were alive but not really living, who went through the motions of existence while being internally consumed by their addiction. These gambling zombies could be found throughout the empire, shuffling through the motions of daily life while their minds were always focused on the next opportunity to play. They worked not to build better lives for themselves, but to accumulate gambling stakes. They formed relationships not based on love or friendship, but on access to money or information that might help with betting. They lived in a parallel universe where the normal concerns of human existence, health, family, security, happiness, had been replaced by the single overriding obsession with beating odds that were mathematically designed to beat them. And the truly heartbreaking part is that they often knew this. Many gambling addicts in ancient Rome were intelligent people who understood probability, who knew that the house always wins, who could calculate odds better than the bookmakers themselves. But knowledge isn't the same as wisdom, and understanding isn't the same as acceptance. Knowing that you can't win doesn't stop you from believing that this time will be different, that your luck is about to change, that the gods have finally decided to smile on you. Scribonius spent his final years caught in this trap, working off debts that kept growing despite his labor, gambling away money he couldn't afford to lose, chasing wins that became less likely with each passing day. He He died alone in the pottery workshop, collapsed over an amphora he was decorating, his last thoughts probably focused on the dice game he was planning to attend that evening. His creditors sold his body to the gladiator schools for anatomical study. It was worth more dead than alive, which was perhaps the most fitting epitaph for a life destroyed by the pursuit of easy money. But Scribonius's story wasn't unique. It was repeated thousands of times across the Roman Empire. In every city and town where games of chance offered the false promise of wealth without work. The details varied, but the pattern remained the same. Initial success, growing confidence, larger bets, mounting losses, desperate attempts to win it all back, and final destruction. The Roman gambling industry understood this pattern and exploited it ruthlessly. They created environments designed to maximize addiction, legal systems that ensured debts could never be escaped, and social pressures that made gambling seem not just acceptable but necessary for masculine identity. They turned human weakness into systematic profit, and they did it so successfully that their basic model would be copied by gambling operations for the next 2,000 years. Human nature hasn't changed much since ancient Rome. The psychological triggers that made Romans vulnerable to gambling addiction are the same ones that affect people today. The desire for easy money, the thrill of risk, the belief that we can beat the odds through skill or luck or divine favor. What has changed is our understanding of addiction as a medical condition rather than a moral failing, and our development of legal and social systems that provide some protection for people who fall into these traps. But the basic dynamic remains the same. Somewhere tonight in Las Vegas or Atlantic City or Monte Carlo, someone is making the same mistakes that Scribonius made 2,000 years ago. They're convinced that this time will be different, that they found a system that works, that they're due for a big win after so many losses. And somewhere else, people who understand human psychology and mathematics are setting up games designed to separate those players from their money, just as efficiently as the Roman gambling operators did in the shadow of the Colosseum. The house always wins, the die is always cast, and the human capacity for hope in the face of impossible odds remains as strong as it was when gladiators fought for the entertainment of emperors and ordinary Romans, bet their freedom on the turn of a bone die. Some things, it seems, never change, but the Romans didn't just destroy individual lives through gambling. They perfected the art of making addiction profitable on an industrial scale. And nowhere was this more evident than in the underground economy that flourished in the spaces between official Roman society. Picture the Cloaca Maxima, Rome's great sewer system, not just as an engineering marvel, but as the literal and metaphorical foundation of a hidden gambling empire. In the maintenance tunnels and forgotten chambers beneath the city, a different kind of Rome operated under different rules. Here, in the damp darkness lit by oil lamps and the occasional shaft of sunlight from street grates above, the most desperate gambling addicts gathered for games that would have shocked even the jaded audiences of the Colosseum. These weren't the genteel dice games of the taverns or the sophisticated betting pools of the Circus Maximus. These were contests born of pure desperation, where the stakes weren't money or property, but pieces of human dignity. The sewer games, as they came to be known, operated on a simple principle. When you have nothing left to bet, you bet yourself. Not your labor, not your freedom, but your actual physical being. Limbs, organs, years of life. The currency of the truly desperate. One popular game involved rats. The sewers of Rome were infested with them, some as large as cats, and they were vicious when cornered. Players would bet on how long they could keep their hand in a box full of hungry rats without pulling it out. The longer you lasted, the more you won. The catch was that pulling your hand out before the agreed time meant forfeiting whatever body part the rats had been gnawing on. Another game involved the sewer gas itself, certain chambers filled with methane and other toxic vapors that could kill in minutes. Players would bet on who could stay in these chambers longest, breathing poison for the chance at a payout. Winners emerged gasping and half dead but wealthy. Losers didn't emerge at all. But perhaps the most psychologically devastating game was called Memory's Price. Players would bet their own memories, literally wagering their ability to remember loved ones, childhood experiences, or professional skills. The mechanism was crude but effective. Repeated blows to specific parts of the head, administered by skilled torturers who understood which impacts would erase which types of memories. You might wonder how anyone could verify such bets, how you could prove that someone had actually lost their memories rather than just pretending. The answer reveals the horrifying sophistication of the underground gambling economy. They had developed tests, procedures, ways of confirming that a person's memories had been genuinely destroyed. More importantly, they had customers for these damaged people. Roman society had uses for individuals who retained their physical capabilities but had lost their emotional connections, their sense of identity, their ability to form new relationships. Perfect slaves, in other words, completely functional but utterly docile. The market for memory-wiped humans was surprisingly robust. Wealthy Romans paid premium prices for servants who couldn't remember their former lives, who had no emotional attachments that might interfere with their duties. Gladiator schools bought men who retained their fighting skills but had lost their fear of death. Brothels purchased women who couldn't remember their families or their former social status. This underground economy reveals something crucial about Roman gambling culture that the surface-level games obscured. The addiction wasn't really about money, wasn't even about the thrill of risk. It was about the fundamental human need to feel that your choices matter, that your actions have consequences, that you have some control over your fate. For people who had lost everything else, gambling offered the illusion of agency. When you bet your memories, your limbs, your life, you were still making choices. Terrible choices, self-destructive choices, but choices nonetheless. In a society where most people were powerless, where slaves outnumbered citizens, and even citizens lived at the mercy of their social superiors, gambling provided a space where individual will could still operate. But the sewer games were just the most extreme example of a broader phenomenon that affected every level of Roman society. The empire had become addicted to gambling just as thoroughly as individuals like Scribonius had become addicted to dice. Consider the political implications. Roman elections, particularly in the later Republic and early Empire, were essentially massive gambling operations. Candidates didn't just seek votes, they organized betting pools around their own campaigns. Citizens would wager on election outcomes, and the odds would shift based on campaign developments, public speeches, and rumors about candidate scandals. This turned elections into sporting events where the actual governance of the empire became secondary to the entertainment value of the contest. Voters weren't just choosing leaders, they were placing bets on which candidate would provide the best return on investment. The betting markets around elections became so sophisticated that they often predicted outcomes more accurately than any other form of polling. Professional gamblers developed elaborate systems for analyzing candidate viability, voter sentiment, and the likelihood of various campaign strategies succeeding. But the real corruption occurred when candidates began manipulating their own campaigns to affect betting outcomes. A candidate might deliberately underperform in early debates to drive up the odds against him, then bet heavily on his own victory before revealing his true capabilities in the final stretch. Or candidates might coordinate with opponents to create artificial drama that would generate more betting interest. Fake scandals, staged confrontations, manufactured controversies designed not to influence voters but to create more interesting betting propositions. The line between governance and entertainment became so blurred that some elections were essentially rigged gambling events where the actual business of selecting leaders was subordinated to the need to create profitable betting opportunities. This political gambling had consequences that extended far beyond Rome itself. Provincial governors were sometimes selected not based on their administrative capabilities, but on their ability to generate interesting betting scenarios. Wars were started or avoided based on how they might affect election betting markets. Treaties were signed or broken to create dramatic reversals that would increase gambling turnover. The entire apparatus of imperial administration became subordinated to the gambling economy. And this wasn't a secret conspiracy or hidden corruption. It was open, acknowledged, considered a normal part of how the Roman system operated. But perhaps nowhere was the intersection of gambling and imperial politics more visible than in the phenomenon of imperial betting. This was the practice of wagering on the survival, actions, and eventual fate of the emperors themselves. Romans would bet on how long an emperor would live, whether he would be assassinated, whether he would go mad, whether he would start wars or make peace. They wagered on imperial succession, on the outcomes of palace intrigue, on which advisors would rise or fall from favor. The betting markets around imperial politics became so active and so sophisticated that they functioned as a kind of shadow government. The odds on various political outcomes often influenced the actual decisions that emperors made, because rulers understood that betting markets reflected genuine public sentiment in ways that official channels might not. Some emperors actively participated in this system, placing bets on their own survival or on the outcomes of their military campaigns. Caligula famously wagered the entire contents of the imperial treasury on his ability to survive a particular assassination plot, reasoning that if he lost the bet, he wouldn't be alive to pay it anyway. But the emperor who most fully embraced the gambling culture was Nero, who turned the entire imperial court into a massive casino. Nero didn't just gamble. He made gambling the central organizing principle of imperial administration. Under Nero, government positions were awarded through games of chance. Military commands were distributed based on dice throws. Tax policies were determined by gladiator matches. The emperor would literally bet provinces of the empire on chariot races, with administrative control changing hands based on which team won. This wasn't madness, though it certainly looked like madness to contemporary observers. It was the logical endpoint of a culture that had become so thoroughly saturated with gambling that no other form of decision-making seemed legitimate or exciting. Nero understood something that modern leaders often miss, that government is ultimately about entertainment, about keeping the population engaged and distracted. By turning imperial administration into a gambling spectacle, he created a form of governance that was simultaneously more democratic and more tyrannical than anything Rome had previously experienced. More democratic because everyone could participate in the betting markets that determined imperial policy. More tyrannical because the outcomes were determined by chance rather than by reason, debate, or consideration of consequences. The Nero system worked brilliantly for entertainment value and terribly for actual governance. The empire during his reign was simultaneously the most exciting and the most dysfunctional it had ever been. Citizens were constantly engaged with imperial politics because they had money riding on the outcomes, but the actual policies were often incoherent because they were determined by dice throws rather than strategic thinking. But here's what's truly fascinating about the Nero experiment. It wasn't rejected by the Roman people because it was based on gambling. It was rejected because Nero lost too often. When the emperor's bets started going bad, when his gambling decisions began producing obviously terrible outcomes, the population turned against him not because they disapproved of gambling-based governance, but because they disapproved of losing. This reveals something profound about Roman culture. They weren't opposed to irrationality or chaos. They were opposed to unsuccessful irrationality and unsuccessful chaos. If Nero's gambling had produced good outcomes, if his dice-based decisions had led to military victories and economic prosperity, he might have been remembered as one of Rome's greatest emperors. Instead, he became a cautionary tale about the dangers of letting gambling addiction influence imperial policy. But the lesson the Romans learned wasn't that gambling was bad. The lesson they learned was that emperors needed to be better gamblers. This cultural attitude toward gambling and governance helps explain why Roman civilization, despite its many achievements, was ultimately unstable. When your decision-making processes are based on chance rather than analysis, when your leaders are selected for their entertainment value rather than their competence, when your policies are determined by betting markets rather than strategic planning, you create a system that is inherently unpredictable and ultimately unsustainable. But in the short term, gambling-based governance was incredibly engaging for the population. Citizens felt involved in imperial decision-making in a way that traditional political systems couldn't match. When you have money riding on whether the emperor will invade Germania or make peace with the Parthians, you pay attention to imperial policy in a way that pure civic duty could never motivate. The gambling economy also created a kind of rough democracy where anyone with money could influence imperial decisions by placing large enough bets to move the markets. Wealthy merchants could effectively vote on policy through their betting patterns. Even slaves could pool their meager resources to place collective bets that might influence minor administrative decisions. This system was chaotic, irrational, and ultimately destructive. But it was also more participatory and more responsive to popular sentiment than the formal political institutions of the Republic or the early Empire. The tragedy is that this gambling-based pseudo-democracy was ultimately controlled by the same professional gambling operators who ran the dice games and the gladiator betting pools. The people who understood how to manipulate odds, how to create artificial drama, how to exploit human psychology for profit. So while ordinary Romans thought they were participating in governance through their betting, they were actually being manipulated by gambling entrepreneurs who had figured out how to monetize political engagement. The betting markets that seemed to give citizens influence over imperial policy were actually sophisticated systems for extracting wealth from the population while creating the illusion of democratic participation. This is perhaps the most chilling aspect of Roman gambling culture, its ability to transform genuine political engagement into profitable entertainment. Citizens thought they were influencing policy when they were actually just providing revenue for gambling operators. They felt empowered when they were actually being systematically exploited. And the most insidious part was that the system worked well enough, often enough, that people couldn't see the exploitation. Sometimes the betting markets did influence policy in ways that benefited ordinary citizens. Sometimes the gambling-based decisions produced good outcomes. Sometimes the chaos was preferable to the alternatives. But in the long run, a civilization that bases its decision-making on games of chance rather than rational analysis is doomed to make catastrophically bad choices. And when those bad choices accumulate over time, when the gambling losses mount up to the point where they threaten the survival of the system itself, the inevitable result is collapse. Rome didn't fall because of barbarian invasions or economic decline or military weakness, though all of those factors played a role. Rome fell because it had become a gambling addict on a civilizational scale, making increasingly desperate bets with stakes it couldn't afford to lose, chasing losses with bigger and bigger wagers until the entire system imploded under the weight of accumulated bad decisions. The individual gambling addicts like Scribonius were just symptoms of a larger disease that had infected the entire culture. When your civilization treats governance as entertainment, when your leaders are selected for their gambling skills rather than their wisdom, when your policies are determined by dice throws rather than careful analysis, you create a system that is inherently unstable and ultimately doomed. But understanding this larger context doesn't diminish the human tragedy of individual addiction. If anything, it makes the stories of people like Scribonius more poignant, because it shows how they were trapped not just by their own psychological weaknesses, but by a culture that had systematically organized itself around the exploitation of those weaknesses. The Romans created a civilization that was designed to produce gambling addicts, then blamed the addicts for the problems that their addiction caused. They built a society where rational decision-making was impossible, then condemned individuals who made irrational choices. They created systems that rewarded short-term thinking and punished long-term planning, then wondered why their empire couldn't sustain itself over time. In the end, the story of gambling addiction in ancient Rome isn't just about individual human weakness. It's about the dangers of organizing a civilization around the systematic exploitation of human psychology. It's about what happens when entertainment becomes more important than governance, when profit becomes more important than sustainability, when the thrill of risk becomes more important than the consequences of failure. The Romans learned too late that you cannot build a lasting civilization on a foundation of games of chance. The dice always stop rolling eventually. The bets always come due. And when they do, the house doesn't always win. Sometimes everybody loses. The sun was setting over the Tiber when Marcus Fulvius made the decision that would cost him everything he had ever loved. Standing in the shadow of the temple of Jupiter, Optimus Maximus, clutching a leather pouch containing the deed to his family's vineyard, he could hear the roar of the crowd from the Campus Martius, where the evening's gladiator exhibitions were reaching their climax. 3 months earlier, Marcus had been a prosperous wine merchant with estates in Campania, a respected position in his local municipality, and a reputation for shrewd business dealings. Tonight, he was about to bet his children's inheritance on whether a Nubian gladiator named Typhon could survive 3 consecutive matches against seasoned veterans. The transformation hadn't happened overnight. Like most Roman gambling stories, it began with what seemed like harmless entertainment among friends. A few sestertii wagered on dice games during dinner parties, small bets on which merchant ship would dock first at Ostia. The kind of casual gambling that was considered not just acceptable but essential for maintaining one's social standing among the Roman elite. But Marcus had discovered something that would prove to be his undoing. He was good at it. Not just lucky, but genuinely skilled at reading odds, understanding probability, predicting outcomes. His mathematical mind, honed by years of calculating wine harvests and shipping costs, seemed perfectly suited to the complex betting markets that surrounded Roman entertainment. His first major win came during the Ludimegalenses, the spring festival honoring the great mother goddess. Marcus had noticed that one of the blue faction's lead horses had been favoring its left rear leg during practice runs. Nothing obvious, just a slight hesitation that most spectators would miss. But Marcus had grown up around horses on his family's estate, and he knew the signs of an animal that was one hard turn away from catastrophe. The odds heavily favored the Blues that day. They had won the previous 3 races, their driver was at the peak of his career, and their horses were considered the finest in Rome. But Marcus bet everything he had brought to the circus on the greens, knowing that when the blue chariot hit the turn at the Spina, disaster would follow. He was right. The horse went down in spectacular fashion, taking 2 other chariots with it in a crash that left the track littered with splintered wood and screaming animals. The greens sailed through the chaos to an easy victory, and Marcus walked away with enough money to buy a second vineyard. That win changed everything, not just financially, though the money was certainly welcome, but psychologically. Marcus had proven to himself that gambling wasn't just about luck, it was about knowledge, observation, careful analysis. It was, in other words, a form of business that happened to be more exciting than selling wine. He began studying the gladiator schools with the same intensity he had once applied to viticulture. He learned the fighting styles of individual gladiators, tracked their injury histories, understood the politics of the various schools. He developed contacts among the trainers, the doctors, the slaves who cleaned the equipment. Information became his currency, and he spent it wisely. For 6 months, Marcus won more often than he lost. Not every bet, but enough to feel confident that he had found a sustainable system. He diversified his gambling portfolio the way a modern investor might diversify his stock holdings. Gladiator matches for the big payouts, chariot races for steady income, dice games for social entertainment. But the Roman gambling ecosystem was designed to exploit exactly this kind of confidence. The games weren't just random chance, they were carefully calibrated psychological traps that used early success to lure victims into deeper and deeper commitment. The gladiator schools, for instance, weren't just training facilities. They were information warfare operations that deliberately leaked false intelligence to betting markets. A trainer might let slip that his star fighter was struggling with a shoulder injury, driving down the odds, then reveal on fight day that the injury was completely fabricated. The chariot teams employed what we would now recognize as sophisticated market manipulation techniques. They would deliberately underperform in practice sessions, throw meaningless early season races, even injure their own horses to create betting opportunities around their comeback performances. Even the dice games weren't as random as they appeared. Professional gamblers had developed techniques for subtly influencing the roll of knucklebones through careful wrist movements and release timing. Not enough to guarantee outcomes, but enough to shift the odds by a few percentage points that compounded over hundreds of throws. Marcus, for all his intelligence and careful observation, was playing against opponents who had spent their entire lives perfecting the art of deception. His early wins weren't proof of his skill, they were evidence that he hadn't yet been targeted by the professionals who controlled the Roman gambling economy. The targeting began subtly. A fellow wine merchant mentioned a sure thing gladiator match where inside information suggested a massive upset was brewing. A chariot team owner casually revealed during a dinner party that his best driver was considering retirement, information that could be valuable for betting on future races. These weren't random tips from fellow gamblers, they were carefully planted pieces of disinformation designed to draw Marcus into bigger and riskier bets. The gambling syndicates had identified him as a successful amateur who was ready to be separated from his winnings. The trap was sprung during the Ides of Julius, when Rome celebrated the month named for the divine Caesar, with particularly elaborate gladiator games. Marcus received what seemed like incredibly valuable intelligence. Commodus, the reigning champion of the Ludus Magnus, was planning to throw his next fight to settle a personal debt. The information came from a source Marcus trusted, a trainer who had provided accurate tips in the past. The odds against Commodus were enormous because he was considered unbeatable. A bet against him would pay out at 20-to-1 odds, enough to multiply Marcus's gambling bankroll several times over. Marcus mortgaged one of his vineyards to raise the necessary capital. It seemed like a reasonable risk given the potential return and the reliability of his source. He placed the largest bet of his gambling career, wagering more money than most Romans would see in a lifetime. Commodus won his fight in the first minute, dispatching his opponent with a casual efficiency that left no doubt about the outcome. The inside information had been completely fabricated, designed specifically to lure Marcus into a bet that would wipe out his accumulated winnings and force him into debt. This is where Roman gambling addiction reveals its most vicious psychological dimension. The loss wasn't just financial, it was a complete destruction of Marcus's self-image as a skilled gambler who could beat the system through intelligence and observation. A rational person might have recognized this as evidence that the games were rigged, that the professional gambling operators were too sophisticated for amateur players to compete against. But gambling addiction doesn't operate according to rational principles. It operates according to emotional ones. Marcus couldn't accept that he had been outsmarted. The loss had to be explained by bad luck, by a temporary setback, by anything other than the possibility that his entire approach to gambling was fundamentally flawed. So instead of walking away, he doubled down. He mortgaged his remaining vineyard to raise more gambling capital. He borrowed against his wife's dowry, his children's inheritance, his own future earnings. Each new infusion of money was going to be the stake that would win back everything he had lost. But now Marcus was playing with desperation rather than confidence, and desperation is exactly what professional gamblers look for in their victims. His bets became larger and less rational. His information sources became less reliable. His emotional investment in each outcome became more intense. The Roman gambling culture was perfectly designed to exploit this kind of psychological vulnerability. The games offered just enough legitimate skill-based elements to maintain the illusion that success was possible through intelligence and effort. But they were ultimately controlled by operators who had every advantage: better information, more capital, deeper understanding of human psychology, and no emotional attachment to the outcomes. Marcus found himself caught in the classic gambling addiction spiral, chasing losses with bigger bets, convincing himself that the next win would solve all his problems, becoming increasingly isolated from family and friends who couldn't understand his obsession. But Roman society offered gambling addicts opportunities for self-destruction that would have shocked even the most jaded modern casino operators. When Marcus ran out of conventional assets to bet, he discovered that Roman law allowed him to wager his own freedom, his family's liberty, even his children's future. The legal framework that supported slavery also supported debt bondage, and debt bondage was just slavery with better marketing. A Roman who couldn't pay his gambling debts could indenture himself to his creditors, working off the debt through labor. But the terms were set by the creditors, and the creditors were often the same people who operated the gambling establishments. This created a system where gambling losses could be converted into permanent servitude. A man who bet his freedom on a gladiator match and lost didn't just owe money, he owed his life. And since debt slaves could still gamble their remaining possessions, the cycle could continue indefinitely. Marcus discovered this legal reality when his creditors informed him that his debts had grown beyond his ability to pay through conventional means. The accumulated interest, penalties, and fees had created an obligation that exceeded the value of everything he owned. But Roman law offered a solution. He could work off the debt as a bonded laborer. The terms seemed almost reasonable. 15 years of labor at standard wages would satisfy his obligations. He would retain his citizenship, his legal rights, his status as a free Roman. The only catch was that 15 years of labor would leave him too old to rebuild his life, too broken to start over, too damaged to reclaim any semblance of his former existence. But even debt bondage couldn't cure Marcus's gambling addiction. Working in a brick kiln outside Rome, earning barely enough to survive, he still found ways to place bets on the weekend gladiator matches. The stakes were smaller now, measured in copper coins rather than gold aurae, but the compulsion remained as strong as ever. This is where Roman gambling culture reveals its most tragic dimension. The addiction wasn't really about money or even about the thrill of risk. It was about the need to feel that your choices mattered, that you had some control over your fate, that the future could be different from the present. For someone like Marcus, who had fallen from prosperity to bondage, gambling offered the only remaining space where individual agency could still operate. When you bet your day's wages on a dice throw, you were still making decisions, still influencing outcomes, still participating in the world of possibility rather than resignation. But the Roman gambling operators understood this psychological need and exploited it ruthlessly. They created games specifically designed for debt slaves, poor laborers, and other desperate people who had little money but enormous emotional investment in the outcomes. These games were different from the elaborate gladiator betting or chariot race wagering that entertained the wealthy. They were simple, immediate, and designed to provide maximum psychological impact for minimum financial outlay. A copper coin could buy you a moment of hope, a chance to imagine that tomorrow might be different from today. The most popular of these desperation games was called Fortuna's Wheel, though it bore no resemblance to the modern casino game. Players would bet on the outcome of a spinning pottery wheel marked with various symbols. The odds were terrible, the house edge enormous, but the game was fast enough that players could experience dozens of wins and losses in a single evening. The psychological hook was the speed of play. Unlike gladiator matches or chariot races that happened on fixed schedules, Fortuna's Wheel could be played continuously. A player who lost could immediately try again, chasing the loss with another bet, then another, then another. Marcus found himself drawn to these games because they offered something that his former high-stakes gambling couldn't: the possibility of frequent small wins that could temporarily relieve the psychological pressure of his situation. When you won a few copper coins at Fortuna's Wheel, you could buy a better meal, a cup of decent wine, a moment of comfort in an otherwise miserable existence. But the small wins were carefully calibrated to keep players engaged without actually improving their situations. The house edge ensured that players would lose more than they won over time, but the distribution of wins and losses was designed to maintain hope and encourage continued play. This is where Roman gambling psychology reaches its most sophisticated level. The operators understood that different types of people needed different types of games to maintain their addiction. Wealthy Romans needed high stakes, skill-based games that made them feel intelligent and powerful. Poor Romans needed frequent, low-stakes games that provided emotional relief from their desperate circumstances. The same gambling establishments often offered both types of games, creating a complete ecosystem where every level of Roman society could find an appropriate way to destroy themselves financially while feeling entertained. But the most insidious aspect of this system was how it created the illusion of social mobility through gambling. The games were designed so that occasional large wins were possible, even likely for some players. This created a steady stream of success stories that could be used to market the gambling lifestyle to new victims. Every gambling establishment had its legends: the slave who won his freedom on a single dice throw, the debt laborer who parlayed a copper coin into a gold aureus, the broken-down ex-soldier who retired wealthy after one perfect bet on the gladiator games. These stories were often true, but they represented a tiny fraction of the people who attempted such transformations through gambling. For every success story, there were hundreds of tragedies, like Marcus's story. But the tragedies weren't talked about, weren't celebrated, weren't used to market anything. The Roman gambling industry had perfected the art of selective storytelling, highlighting the rare wins while minimizing the common losses. This created a cultural narrative that gambling was a viable path to prosperity rather than a systematic method for redistributing wealth from gamblers to gambling operators. Marcus lived the rest of his life trapped in this narrative, always believing that his next bet might be the one that changed everything. He died in the brick kiln, still owing money to his creditors, still planning the gambling strategy that would finally win back his freedom. His story wasn't unique. It was repeated thousands of times across the Roman Empire, in every city where games of chance offered false hope to desperate people. The details varied, but the pattern remained constant. Initial success, growing confidence, larger bets, devastating losses, desperate attempts at recovery, and final destruction. But Marcus's individual tragedy was just one thread in a larger tapestry of cultural destruction that gambling had woven throughout Roman society. The same psychological mechanisms that destroyed individual lives were also undermining the institutions, relationships, and values that held the empire together. When gambling becomes the primary form of entertainment, when risk-taking becomes more valued than careful planning, when short-term excitement becomes more important than long-term stability, you create a civilization that is inherently unsustainable. The Romans learned this lesson too late to save themselves, but their experience offers a warning that remains relevant today, that societies, like individuals, can become addicted to games of chance. And when they do, the house always wins, even when the house is an entire civilization, and the stakes are everything that makes life worth living. The autumn wind carried the smell of burning leaves and spilled wine through the streets of the Subura as another generation of Romans discovered the intoxicating thrill of games they couldn't afford to lose. In taverns and brothels, in private clubs and public squares, the dice kept rolling, the bets kept growing, and new victims kept stepping forward to test their luck against odds that had been calculated to destroy them. The cycle continued, as it always had, as it always would, until the last Roman coin was wagered and lost, and the empire itself became just another casualty of humanity's eternal struggle with the dangerous allure of easy money. But that's a story for another night, when we'll explore how an entire civilization can gamble away its future, one throw of the dice at a time. The morning after the autumn equinox, when the festival of Bacchus had left the streets littered with wine-stained togas and broken pottery, a new kind of desperation gripped the Roman underworld. The seasonal festivals weren't just religious celebrations, they were carefully orchestrated gambling extravaganzas that generated more revenue than some provinces contributed in annual taxes. But these festivals also created a specific type of gambling victim, the seasonal addict who could maintain the illusion of control for most of the year, only to lose everything during the concentrated madness of religious celebration. Consider the case of Lucius Fabius Maximus, a grain merchant who had successfully managed his gambling impulses for 3 years running. Fabius understood his weakness and had developed what seemed like a foolproof system for controlling it. He allowed himself to gamble only during major festivals, set strict limits on his betting, and never wagered more than he could afford to lose. This controlled approach had worked brilliantly. Fabius enjoyed the social aspects of gambling, the excitement of the games, the camaraderie of the betting crowds, without suffering the devastating losses that destroyed other men. He was, in his own mind, proof that intelligent Romans could enjoy gambling without becoming enslaved by it. But the festival seasons in Rome weren't designed for controlled gambling. They were designed to overwhelm every rational defense that careful people like Fabius had constructed against their own impulses. The Bacchanalia lasted for 7 days and nights of continuous celebration. Wine flowed freely, social inhibitions disappeared, and the gambling establishments operated around the clock to accommodate the crowds of revelers who had temporarily escaped the normal constraints of Roman society. During these festivals, the usual gambling games were supplemented by special events that existed nowhere else in the Roman calendar. Mystery games, where the rules were revealed only after bets were placed. Auction-style betting, where participants bid against each other for the right to wager on predetermined outcomes. Tournament formats that combined skill, chance, and endurance in ways that made calculating odds nearly impossible. The psychological impact was overwhelming. Fabius found himself in gambling environments that were unlike anything he had experienced during his carefully controlled festival betting. The games were more complex, the stakes were higher, the other players were more sophisticated, and the entire atmosphere was designed to break down rational decision-making. But the most dangerous aspect of festival gambling wasn't the games themselves. It was the credit system that operated during these periods. Normal Roman banking laws were suspended during major festivals, allowing gambling establishments to offer lines of credit that would have been illegal during regular business periods. Festival credit worked on a simple principle. You could bet money you didn't have, secured by property you hadn't yet lost, against winnings you might never receive. The accounting was handled by professional scribes who specialized in the complex financial instruments that festival gambling required. A typical festival credit arrangement might allow a gambler to bet up to 10 times his liquid assets, with the understanding that losses would be collected through property seizure, debt bondage, or other forms of legally sanctioned coercion. But the collection wouldn't happen until after the festival ended, creating a temporary fantasy world where consequences seemed distant and abstract. Fabius discovered this system on the 3rd night of Bacchanalia, when his carefully hoarded gambling budget had been exhausted by a series of small losses at dice games. A well-dressed scribe approached him at a wine bar near the Circus Flaminius and offered to arrange festival credit that would allow him to continue playing. The terms seemed reasonable. Fabius could borrow up to 50,000 sestertii against the value of his grain warehouses, with repayment due 30 days after the festival ended. The interest rate was modest by Roman standards, and the scribe assured him that the arrangement was completely legal and commonly used by respectable merchants during festival periods. What the scribe didn't mention was that festival credit agreements included clauses that made them far more dangerous than conventional loans. If a borrower couldn't repay the full amount within the specified time period, the debt automatically doubled. If payment was still not forthcoming after another 30 days, the debt doubled again. More importantly, festival credit agreements couldn't be discharged through normal bankruptcy procedures. They were classified as sacred debts connected to the religious nature of the festivals, and Roman law treated them with the same seriousness as temple obligations or military service requirements. Fabius signed the agreement without reading the fine print, focused entirely on returning to the games that had been calling to him from across the festival grounds. With 50,000 sestertii of borrowed money burning in his purse, he felt wealthy and powerful again, ready to recoup his losses and perhaps even turn a profit on the evening's activities. But festival gambling operated according to different rules than the controlled betting Fabius was accustomed to. The games were designed for wealthy Romans who could afford to lose enormous sums, not for middle-class merchants operating on borrowed money. The minimum bets were higher, the odds were worse, and the other players were either extremely wealthy or extremely desperate. Fabius found himself caught between two categories of gambler that he couldn't compete with. The wealthy players had unlimited resources and could afford to wait for favorable opportunities, making small bets with good odds rather than large bets with poor ones. The desperate players had nothing left to lose and were willing to take risks that no rational person would consider. As a middle-class merchant with borrowed money, Fabius couldn't afford to wait for good opportunities like the wealthy players, but he also couldn't afford to take the extreme risks that the desperate players were taking. He was trapped in a middle ground where every decision was wrong, every bet was suboptimal, and every outcome moved him closer to financial ruin. The festival environment made rational analysis nearly impossible. The wine, the noise, the excitement, the sleep deprivation, the constant pressure to keep playing all combined to create a state of mind where careful calculation became impossible and emotional decision-making took over. Fabius began making larger and larger bets, not because he had developed a strategy for winning, but because smaller bets felt insignificant in the context of the enormous sums being wagered around him. When you're sitting at a table where other players are casually betting more money than you earn in a year, a few thousand sestertii starts to feel like pocket change. But the mathematics of gambling don't change based on the size of the stakes or the wealth of the other players. Bad odds are bad odds, regardless of whether you're betting copper coins or gold ori. The house edge that destroys poor Romans works just as efficiently on middle-class merchants who think they're playing in a different league. By the fifth night of Bacchanalia, Fabius had lost not only his original gambling budget and his borrowed festival credit, but had also signed additional agreements that put his grain business, his family home, and his children's inheritance at risk. The festival credit had led to supplemental credit, which had led to emergency credit, which had led to crisis credit. Each new borrowing arrangement had worse terms than the previous one, but each also offered the possibility of winning back everything that had been lost. The logic was seductive. If you owed 50,000 sestertii, winning 60,000 would not only clear your debt, but leave you with a profit. The larger the debt became, the larger the potential reward for clearing it with a single big win. This is where festival gambling reveals its most insidious psychological trap. The credit system was designed to escalate commitment, to make each loss feel like an investment in an eventual recovery, rather than evidence that the situation was hopeless. Professional gamblers called this the festival spiral, and they had perfected techniques for identifying and exploiting merchants like Fabius who were caught in it. These techniques involved providing just enough small wins to maintain hope while ensuring that the overall trajectory remained downward. A professional might deliberately lose a few small bets to Fabius, building his confidence and encouraging larger wagers, then systematically win back everything, plus additional amounts through superior skill or inside information. The small losses were an investment in much larger eventual gains. But the festival spiral wasn't just about individual psychology, it was about social psychology as well. Festival gambling took place in a highly social environment where reputation, status, and peer pressure all played important roles in decision-making. Fabius found himself gambling not just against the odds, but against the expectations of other players who had observed his descent into debt and desperation. Walking away from the games would have been seen as an admission of defeat, a public acknowledgement that he couldn't afford to play at their level. The social dynamics of Roman gambling culture made it almost impossible for someone in Fabius's position to make rational decisions about cutting losses and preserving what remained of his wealth. Quitting while losing was seen as cowardice, while continuing to play despite mounting losses was seen as courage and determination. This social pressure was particularly intense during festivals, when normal Roman class distinctions were temporarily suspended and gambling success became the primary measure of social status. A grain merchant who could hold his own at the high-stakes tables was temporarily elevated to the same social level as senators and military commanders. But a grain merchant who lost everything and had to slink away in defeat was not just financially ruined, he was socially humiliated in a way that would follow him for the rest of his life. The festival gambling community had long memories for spectacular failures, and Fabius's story would become entertainment for future festival seasons. By the final night of Bacchanalia, Fabius had reached the point where he was betting not just his own property, but his family's freedom. Roman law allowed debtors to indenture their wives and children to satisfy gambling obligations, and Fabius had signed agreements that put his entire household at risk. The final game was a gladiator exhibition that had been specially arranged for the festival's conclusion. 3 veteran fighters against a single condemned criminal, with betting pools that offered enormous payouts for anyone brave enough to bet on the underdog. Fabius placed everything he had left, everything he had borrowed, and everything his family owned on the condemned man, reasoning that the odds were so poor that the potential payout would solve all his problems if the impossible happened. The condemned man was a Germanic warrior who had been captured during recent campaigns along the Rhine. He was young, strong, and motivated by the promise of freedom if he could somehow survive the encounter. But he was also untrained in gladiatorial combat, unfamiliar with Roman weapons, and facing 3 professional killers who had survived dozens of matches each. The fight lasted less than 10 minutes. The Germanic warrior managed to wound one of his opponents before being overwhelmed by superior numbers and experience. He died bravely, but he died nonetheless, taking Fabius's last hope with him into the sand of the arena. The festival ended with Fabius standing outside the amphitheater, watching slaves clean blood from the arena floor, while scribes calculated the debts that would destroy his life. Everything he had worked for, everything his family had built over generations, everything his children might have inherited, gone in 7 nights of festival gambling. But the truly tragic aspect of Fabius's story wasn't just the financial ruin, it was the realization that his 3 years of controlled gambling hadn't been evidence of his ability to manage his addiction. They had been evidence of the addiction's patience, its willingness to wait for the right moment to strike. The festival system was designed to exploit exactly this kind of false confidence. Romans who thought they had their gambling under control were the most valuable targets because they were willing to risk the most when the right opportunity presented itself. Fabius had been carefully cultivated by the gambling industry for 3 years, allowed to win small amounts and maintain his illusion of control, all in preparation for a festival season that would strip away everything he had accumulated. This cultivation process was one of the most sophisticated aspects of Roman gambling culture. The operators understood that the biggest profits came not from desperate people who had nothing to lose, but from successful people who had everything to lose and could be convinced to risk it all at the right moment. The festival seasons provided those moments, creating artificial environments where normal restraints were removed and careful people could be induced to make catastrophically poor decisions. But the festival system also reveals something darker about Roman society as a whole. The same culture that celebrated discipline, order, and rational planning also created institutions designed to reward the complete abandonment of those values. Romans were taught from childhood to value self-control, long-term thinking, and careful resource management. But they were also taught that true virtue required the willingness to risk everything for glory, that fortune favored the bold, and that a life without risk was a life without honor. This cultural contradiction created a psychological vulnerability that the gambling industry exploited ruthlessly. The same values that made Romans successful in business, politics, and warfare also made them susceptible to the appeal of high-stakes gambling. The festival seasons institutionalized this contradiction, creating temporary periods when the abandonment of self-control was not just acceptable but expected. Romans who spent 11 months of the year practicing discipline and restraint were encouraged to spend 1 month embracing chaos and excess. The gambling operators understood that this cultural pattern created enormous pent-up demand for risk-taking behavior. Romans who had been suppressing their gambling impulses all year would explode into frenzied betting activity during festival periods, often losing in a few days what they had accumulated over many months. This cyclical pattern of restraint followed by excess was incredibly profitable for the gambling industry, but it was also incredibly destructive for Roman society as a whole. It created a culture where rational planning was constantly undermined by periodic outbreaks of irrational behavior. The festival gambling system also had broader economic consequences that extended far beyond individual tragedies like Fabius's story. When large numbers of middle-class Romans lost their businesses and property during festival seasons, it created instability in the broader economy. Grain merchants, wine dealers, textile manufacturers, and other essential businesses were regularly destroyed by festival gambling, creating shortages and price fluctuations that affected everyone in Roman society. The gambling industry was essentially cannibalizing the productive economy that supported it. But the most insidious aspect of the festival system was how it normalized financial destruction as a form of entertainment. Romans came to expect that each festival season would produce a crop of spectacular gambling failures that would provide gossip and amusement for the rest of the year. The ruin of men like Fabius wasn't seen as a social problem that needed to be addressed. It was seen as entertainment that added excitement to the festival experience. The gambling industry had successfully convinced Roman society that the destruction of individual lives was an acceptable price to pay for collective entertainment. This normalization of destruction reveals something profoundly disturbing about Roman values. A society that finds entertainment in the systematic ruin of its own citizens is a society that has lost touch with the basic human values that make civilization possible. The festival gambling system was, in many ways, a perfect metaphor for Roman civilization as a whole. Spectacular, exciting, profitable for a few, and ultimately unsustainable. It created short-term excitement at the cost of long-term stability, concentrated wealth in the hands of operators while impoverishing the general population, and celebrated values that ultimately undermined the society that created them. The Romans built an empire that conquered the known world, but they also built a gambling culture that conquered them. In the end, the dice games and gladiator betting proved more dangerous to Roman civilization than any barbarian army or economic crisis. Because external enemies can be fought with armies and walls and strategic planning. But internal enemies, the psychological vulnerabilities and cultural contradictions that make a society vulnerable to self-destruction, those are much harder to defend against. The gambling addiction that destroyed individual Romans like Fabius and Marcus and Scribonius was the same addiction that ultimately destroyed Roman civilization itself. The same willingness to risk everything for short-term gain, the same belief that the next bet would solve all problems, the same inability to learn from previous losses. Rome gambled away its future, one festival at a time, one bet at a time, one ruined life at a time. And in the end, when the last coins had been wagered and the last bets had been lost, there was nothing left but the memory of what had once been the greatest civilization in the world. The house had won, as it always did. But when the house is an entire culture and the stakes are everything that makes life worth living, winning becomes indistinguishable from losing, and the only victors are time and silence, and the endless turning of wheels that no longer have anyone left to spin them.